Now, our final task here, titled Monitor Virtual Machines, is one that you could literally write a book on. And in fact, I believe some books have been written on this topic. A variety of third party and even Microsoft solutions also exist to help consolidate all the different, sometimes weird kinds of performance counters that occur once you move to virtualization. But trying to distill through all the detail here, what I want to focus our attentions on for the purposes of the 411 is in recognizing that anytime you have a virtual environment with a host and virtual machines, the classic performance counters that you're used to thinking of in the physical world get a little bit shifted in ways that you need to be aware of. I have here a sample Hyper-V host that we've got a couple of virtual machines that are running. I actually don't even have an operating system on these virtual machines. I just wanted to show you that when you have a Hyper-V host with a couple of VMs running on it, those VMs consume available CPU cycles and available memory on that machine. And so when you do have that situation where you've got virtual machines on a host, one of the first places that you should probably look for the most coarse of the possible performance counters would be here inside of Hyper-V Manager. Now think for a minute about the job of a hypervisor in a virtual environment. It is the job of that hypervisor to go about providing attention to virtual machines when they have need to make use of physical resources. So VM1, for example, may need to use the disk at one point in time, and then VM2 may need to use the disk, and then VM3. And one of the basic jobs of the hypervisor is to schedule the use of those physical resources for all the concurrently running virtual machines. Now, because of that, the hypervisor actually kind of has to put virtual machines into a tiny little pause state, if you will, for very short periods of time in order to dedicate its attentions to some other VM. You got 10 different VMs, they're all vying for the disk, well then you've got to time slice the use of that disk across all 10 VMs. It is because of this that your classic CPU and memory counters, and even in some cases with the disk counters, you have to be very careful about which counters you're paying attention to. I would be aware that the counters here inside of Hyper-V Manager are generally going to give you a pretty good representation of the actual resources consumed. But if I bring up perfmon here, I want to direct your attention to a variety of additional counters that you need to be aware of. Down here in perfmon, if I add the counters here, on a host where we have Hyper-V installed, you'll see a long list here of Hyper-V related counters that relate to how this time slicing magic works in a hypervisor environment. There are a couple here that you should pay particular attention to. Obviously, the dynamic memory settings here inside the virtual machines. When we're dealing with dynamic memory, we have to be aware of exactly how much memory is being associated with a particular virtual machine. Also need to take a look here at the hypervisor logical processor and the virtual processor down here. Now, the Hyper-V hypervisor virtual processor counter, and very specifically sub to that, the %guessed runtime, is the most true, the most honest vision into the processor utilization of each virtual machine. And so if you're trying to figure out exactly how much CPU a particular VM is using, it is this %guessed runtime for hypervisor virtual processor that's probably your best view of getting the most accurate count of information. The logical processor also gives you some further information about the actual logical processors in that virtual machine. So back up here, we have the virtual processor, which is the virtualized CPU that we're taking a look at. And then up here under logical processor, we have the representation of the logical processors attached to that VM. Whereas the virtual counter identifies processor use by a specific VM, this second counter gives you utilization by individual logical processor device. And either of these can really come in handy when you're trying to figure out how your Hyper-V virtual machines are making use of the available logical processors that exist on this host. The long and short of it is, for the 70-411, be aware of what these counters are. At least have a familiarity of what the counters are and what they're intended to do. Because, as I said before, anytime you're dealing with virtualization, you've got a slightly different set of counters you have to pay attention to if you want to get to truth.